Welcome to Unleash the Power, IBMI and Beyond, the podcast where we dig into automation, security, modernization, and what's next for the IBMI and beyond. In today's episode, we're diving into the topic that every organization knows is important, but not every organization is fully prepared for, and that is high availability and disaster recovery. Now, for organizations with IBMI environments, this is about much more than just having backups in place. It's about keeping the business running, minimizing downtime, protecting customer experience, and making sure your team is ready when unexpected disruptions happen. Because the reality is, downtime is never convenient. And in many organizations, it's not just an IT problem. It quickly becomes a business problem. So today we're talking about the differences between high availability and disaster recovery, where organizations often have blind spots, and what it really takes to build a resilient strategy that works in the real world. And along with that, we'll touch base on how solutions like Robot HA can support the strategy by helping IBMI teams improve readiness, reduce manual efforts, and respond with greater confidence. I'm joined today by Bob Butcher, a senior solutions engineer here at Fortra. I'm really excited to have Bob on this topic here today because this is one of those topics where real-world experiences matter. Bob, welcome to the podcast, and thanks for joining me today.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Greg.
Yeah, to get us started here, Bob, today, can you tell the listeners a little bit about your background and the kind of work you've done around HA, high availability and disaster recovery?
Sure. I have been on the platform for the IBMI, the Power platform, for 30 years as a system administrator. And one of the things that I've actually done as a customer, I was a Robot HA. I used the Robot HA product as a customer, and I used it because today we'll talk about some of my personal experiences with we've had a disaster. So these are things that I have worked with in the past, and I'm happy to kind of share some of my experiences today.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that the reason why I really love you on this topic here today, because you're going to bring that real world experience to the conversation, which I think is so valuable when it comes to, HA and the DR discussion. So to start us off here today, let's start off by defining the landscape a little. So when people talk about high availability and disaster recovery, those terms often get used together, and sometimes, I should say almost all the time, get interchanged together, right?
Yep.
But they're not the same, right? So they're not
Right.
even close to the same thing. So from your perspective, Bob, how do you explain the difference between high availability and disaster recovery in simple terms?
We talked about this when we talked about the robot space a couple episodes ago. It's going to be the exact same thing, and I'll go into it a little bit here. To me, the main difference between high availability and disaster recovery is high availability is a proactive strategy. So it's there to say, hey, we're gonna help avoid disruptions with the business when they happen. We're gonna figure out a way to eliminate potential points of failure. Maybe you've got extra disk drives, maybe you've got something in place to prevent points of failure in your IT infrastructure. Now, disaster recovery, I think, is more of a reactive strategy. Businesses are going to use that. Businesses we use to deal with, hey, I've got the consequences. I've got a disruptive or some major event has happened that has impacted our IT infrastructure. And disaster recovery is, how am I going to restore my systems? My application, my systems, or an entire data center to get back to full operation. So to me, high availability, think proactive. How am I trying to figure things out so I don't have a major catastrophe, and then disaster recovery is a reactive. What am I going to do when my entire IT infrastructure has been affected by something?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great distinction from that standpoint. Yeah, to me, one of the biggest, takeaways from that, right? Disaster recovery is really about how you recover from that major event. Again, like you said, and then while high availability is more about, reducing disruption, right? As being more
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
proactive kind of structure in there.
Yep.
So yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, awesome. That leads us into something I think a lot of organizations still wrestle with in the industry. There are plenty of teams that feel, I'll say, reasonably confident because they have backups, right? And
Hmm.
backups are obviously important, to business, but backups alone do not necessarily mean business is ready to, for a real outage, right? So,
Right.
what are some of the biggest, I'll say, misconceptions organizations have when and that they believe their backup strategy is enough?
So to me, there's two things that I think of when I think of this, the misconceptions. The first thing is it's great that you're doing a backup, right? I mean, when I think of, a backup, I'm thinking, hey, I'm going to restore a file from my programmer that accidentally deleted some records, or I'm going to, you know, I got to restore a library for testing, or whatever. But the backups are great, but the two things that come to mind to me with backups are, if you've done an entire backup, have you ever tried to restore your system or your critical applications from a backup to get them up and running? See, a lot of people say, hey, I'm going to do a backup and I'm going to restore some things. But have you ever tried to restore an entire system, saying, hey, I got to restore a system from my backup? What's my strategy? And that's where I think, people probably have never done that. Now, the other thing to keep in mind with backups are great, is your backup is a point in time backup. And what I mean is, for example, a lot of customers that I talk to out there, a lot of things that I see with people in the way they do the backups, is they might do a full system backup on a Sunday, and then they'll do some type of incremental or cumulative backup during the week, right, to keep that backup window small. So let's say, for example, you do a daily backup on a Wednesday, right?
Hmm.
And your strategy for a restore from your tapes is, hey, I got to restore. These are the tapes I need. My daily backup runs at 3 a.m. on a Wednesday. Well, let's say Thursday at 2 o'clock in the morning, you have a disaster, hurricane, tornado, something wipes out your data center. The when you go to restore from your tapes, that's great. But at what point are you restoring your data from? Meaning, if your backups were okay the day before, you would actually be restoring from that point in time. So you're almost missing a day in this scenario. And that's where I think one of the misconceptions is, well, I've got a backup tapes, but then it comes out to that recovery point. We talk about that one time,
Yeah.
RPO, recovery point objective. You're recovering and it's not up to date. You're going to be missing a total day's worth of data if you're just doing backups. That's why I think in some of the questions you're probably going to present in a little bit, why logical replication might also be helpful in your scenario of rebuilding your system.
Yeah. And it comes really around what the organization, since, like you said, RTO, RPO conversation, it's really what the business really wants to put as risk, right? At that
Yep.
point.
Yep. Absolutely.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. And if anyone wants to have like a deeper conversation around that, feel free to reach out to us and schedule some time because, that is a deeper conversation around the RTO and RPO side of things and sort of, go through those different steps in a little bit more detail.
Yep.
Awesome. Now let's move from, I'll call it strategy to more reality on the ground, right? So, Bob, let's talk about what you typically see in the real world. What are the most common gaps you see in IBMI environments when it comes to real HA and DR readiness?
So when I read these questions and I sat back, the first thing I thought of is the IBM market study that Fortran does. And I think the first major bullet out there, the biggest thing that people are concerned about is the IBM I talent. I think that was the number one
Yep.
where people are worried about the talent. So I'm coming from some of the things that I wrote down, that I would see as a gap is, first of all, do you have the skill set to do some of this? I know a lot of times when I jump on a call, I've got, like yesterday, I was on a call and somebody's like, yeah, I inherited this thing called an IBMI. Okay. I don't have the skill set to do some of the things with maybe logical replications, my backups. So I think that kind of snowballs into a lack of confidence, right? If I've inherited this system and I don't know how to do it, well, I'm fearful of maybe trying to do another thing, a role swap, right? If I'm doing logical replication, I don't have the skills to do backups or do anything with maybe a logical replication. How am I going to do a role swap? So I think role swap is part of that too. A lot of people might have a third-party piece of software, but they've never done a role swap. They've never tested that stuff. And then other things that I see are people are afraid of downtime. Okay. If you're going to do like a role swap, if you're going to do something in an IBM I environment to get ready for DR, you have to test role swaps. And, people are like, well, I can't afford to be down. And I think that's where it comes into, well, you can't afford to be down, but if you don't test that and you really have to use it, then there's an issue. And probably the last thing I would think of, and we touched on it a little bit before this, have you tested your backups? Have you tested your restore? The company I used to work for, we would have an auditor come in all the time, and they would have us they would pick maybe 10 things to restore from different backups that we had. And I used to kind of cringe. I'm like, this is a waste of time, until you figured out, well, they're just testing to make sure that your backups are okay.
Yeah.
So I think, to me, I think maybe the skill gap, somebody's inherited things and they've got a lack of confidence. They're worried about the complexity of the tools. Maybe they're fearing downtime, and because of the lack of skill, maybe they haven't done a role swap with the environment that they're in, and maybe they haven't tested their backup. So those are kind of the things that I have seen out there, Greg, that I would be concerned about.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and many organizations, that, and obviously you've seen this too, are stronger in theory, right, than in real practice. They might have pieces of a plan. They might have their backups. They might even have some of the replication or failover concepts in place. But when they step back and ask I'll call it the real question, is the full process been tested, documented? And I think a big thing is rehearsed, right? And gone
Exactly.
through those different pieces. I think that's where they look at. And sometimes, it's not, depending on your skill level, you might have, less confidence, but sometimes it's overconfidence,
Right.
assuming things, are in place, right? So I mean, that testing and stuff like that and running through that process, I think is huge. You've sort of ran into that in the real world.
Sure. Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, thanks for that. That brings us to the execution part, right? Because this is where readiness really gets tested, right? Let's stay here just for a moment, because this is really where plans either hold up or start to break down, right? So the question I have for you, Bob, is how do testing and automation improve organizations' ability to respond to an outage or disruption?
So to me, it comes down to one word. I would say repetition. When you start out, I was thinking about one day I was working with my son. We're out shooting free throws. Dad, I can't make any free throws. I'm like, well, we have to rep this. We have to keep practicing. We have to keep practicing. And all of a sudden you get better at things like that. So it's the same thing with this. If you can repeat things, if you can keep practicing things, so that way you can do this stuff in your sleep. The day of trying to test like a role swap is not the day when you have a disaster. And so it's going to be hard at first, but once you start repeating things, once you start going through things, things will be easier. Now, some of the things that I had written down as a customer that were foreign to me, they were hard at first. Through repetition, it made it easier. But we created some pretty complex scripts. Okay, when we did a role swap, we wrote down, this is what we got to do. Well, we got to make sure this application starts before this one. We got to make sure that we're running these jobs in a certain order. So maybe some complex scripting to help you with the role swap, because you're going to want to have a checklist. When you do an IPL, or do you have to do something special at an IPL? Is your network involved with the reconfiguration when you're saying, hey, I've got to go from my production box to my target box with HA, with a role swap in HA? Do I have to reconfigure things in my network? I give you an example. We did not use DNS in my previous life, so when we did role swaps, we had to actually change IP addresses, and it was painful. It was really painful, but as a result of doing that, we went to DNS, and it made the process easier. So the other thing is checking with your third-party vendors. Is there something that's going to happen? Let's say, for example, Greg, with Fortra, a lot of software is based on serial numbers, right? So if you're role swapping from one box to another, well, that other box is going to have a different serial number. So things like, have you checked with your third-party software to make sure that the licensing is going to be okay? It took hours of planning, and it took long windows to simulate this testing. But if you keep repeating things, things will get easier. You will know who needs to be involved. You will know what steps need to be involved. Your checklist will be intact. And if you just keep repeating it, that's the best practice to be successful. And I think a lot of people miss those steps. They don't think about those things.
Yeah, and I take it that checklist comes down to a lot of documentation too, right? And saying here's where
Absolutely.
you go to, here's
Yeah.
the people to call,
Yep.
here's the people to wake up in the
Absolutely.
middle of the night kind of thing if something happens, right?
Yep. Yep. The last thing you want to do is when you declare a disaster, when you're like, okay, my data center's wiped out, that you've practiced your plan so you know what to do. Because believe me, I went through as a customer. We used the Robot HA product, and we got hit with back-to-back floods, and it destroyed our data center. And
Hmm.
so now it's all of a sudden I'm working on 10 different things now because people need help. And I wish we had had something in place like this. It would have just made life a lot easier.
Yeah, and that's a big thing too. You said something a little bit earlier. It's lean on the vendors and stuff too for some of that stuff, right? But lean on the
Absolutely.
experts, right? Especially
Yep.
on whoever you're using for HA and stuff like that. Make sure you're leaning on them for that education piece and how to optimize some of that setup and configuration in there as well.
Yep. Absolutely.
Perfect. Yeah, that's sort of a good brings us to a good place here from that standpoint of, I don't want to make this a product pitch here today, but how automation platforms like Robot HA support a bigger picture, right? From that standpoint. Um, and again, without trying to make this a product pitch or just a product discussion, where does Robot HA fit into a bigger continuity strategy, and how can it help IBMI teams reduce risk and improve readiness?
So, I said before, I was a customer. I was a customer. We had got hit with back-to-back floods as a result of hurricanes. And next thing you know, you wake up, you've got 8 feet of water in your data center, and it's like, okay, what do I do? So once we rebuilt the systems and we got everything running again, these are some of the things that were important to me. These are some of the reasons why I leaned on Robot HA as opposed to some of the other third-party vendors that are out there. First of all, I thought the price compared to some of the other software packages for logical replication was reasonable. I mean, it was cheaper than some of the other things that were out there, and that was one of one of my things on my checklist when I was comparing software. The other thing that I noticed right away was Robot HA, the ease of use of the product. I've had a chance to use some of the products that are out there, and they were very hard to understand. The ease of the use of the product and setting that up, and then maintaining it, I thought was the easiest. It was the easiest thing that I had used out there in the world of logical replication, and that's another reason why I went with Robot HA. The other thing is being a longtime customer of Fortra, the support was second to none. When I've done it several times. When you're in the middle of a disaster, or when you have an issue that's going on your system, I've used software where it's like, you call into support and you get a call 3 days later. When I call into support, I need help now. Okay. And I've always had a human body on the phone, which to me, when you're stressing out over something, I think support is a huge thing. Now, don't get me wrong. The biggest thing is, when you look at the cost, and when you're looking at, hey, can I put something in place to prevent if I have a disaster, you don't really worry about the cost if you got something in place. But the other thing that I like, and that's something that we do now, Greg, is the Robot HA Care. Now Now we had talked about some of the gaps, and I talked about the skill gap. Again, it's on that Fortra marketplace. The skill gap. Robot HA Care is something I absolutely love it. We didn't have it back then when I was the customer, but Robot HA Care kind of can settle, can help people out. It can settle that unknown, right? That skill gap. It can fill in those pieces for you that your staff might not be comfortable with, and Fortran can do kind of the heavy lifting. So the biggest thing I think is the price, the ease of use of the product, the support, and that Robot HA Care would be, the biggest things that I would consider when you're looking at a logical replication piece of software like Robot HA.
Yeah, that robot, the care packages and stuff, I think is one of the huge pluses that we do here at Fortra from that standpoint, because it's just that helping hand, right? It just gets people to that next step, and it might be, hey, we need you to do this for us, or we need just a guidance kind of process, right? So it gives you that self. It makes you happy inside, right? Kind of thing. It makes the business more stable at that point too, because you have someone other than yourself supporting the system.
Yep. Now the last thing I would point out, Greg, and this is just kind of something separate, but I believe Fortra, we support the BRMS package, right?
That's correct.
The software, and we had talked a little bit about backups. I mean, you really Robot logical replication, and I think backups kind of go hand in hand because you need both of them. I think in an environment. But with BRMS, I've heard customers like, hey, I don't understand it. What I like about BRMS, I come from a programming background, so I've done a lot of programming. And I think one of the things with BRMS, if you're out there kind of looking on the fence at a product to use, what I like about BRMS and maybe implementing that in your environment with backups is it kind of simplifies things so you don't have to be a programmer. You can kind of set up a control group to do your backup. You don't have to be a programmer to do that. You can say, hey, maybe I need to run some applications, to shut down a subsystem or this or that. You can set that up in BRMS. So there's a lot of things that you could set up in BRMS to help your backups run smoother as well. And you don't have to be this programmer that's going to put all of these things in a program too. So I wanted to kind of throw that out. I think the logical replication is important, but I think doing your backups is important too. And if you're not sure how to do that or what to do, I would suggest looking at BRMS as maybe an option to set some of that stuff up.
Yeah, that's very true. They both go hand in hand from that standpoint. And that brings up a good point, too, Bob, just for the listeners out there. We do plan on doing some podcasts and some other videos and stuff like that, and some webinars around the BRMS topic. So if there are any things that you would like to see from an education standpoint, or just more knowledge on BRMS, feel free to reach out to us as well here at Fortra on the Power team to discuss some of those different things that we can help provide out to your teams.
Awesome. Well, Greg, thanks for having me. This was great.
Yeah, I really appreciate you joining me today, Bob. I think the discussion was great. I think the big message here is simple, right? Backups matter, but resilience, takes more than backups, right? In most cases, right?
Absolutely.
It just depending on where, what exposure the business wants, from that standpoint. And, IBMI team's working to strengthen that strategy. Robot HA is one of those ways. BRMS is another way, to be able to help with that, to make things, I'll call the process more real, more repeatable, and the big thing is more manageable, right? So thanks, Bob, for joining here again. And thanks everyone for listening to Unleash the Power podcast. Until next time, unleash the power.